Good morning, everybody. Ecclesiastes, we're going to start off with the verse we ended on last week. And this is, we got only a few chapters left. But verse 6 last week, for every activity there is a right time and procedure, even though man's troubles are heavy on him. If you'll remember, Solomon is beginning to make the transition from, I'm bringing you high anxiety, I'm pushing you to the extreme because I want your faith to be pushed to the extreme. But I realize that some of you may be losing all hope. I don't want that. I'm actually trying to push you toward the source, toward the healing, toward the power that you need. And I don't want to drop you someplace where you are in total darkness. So he says, every activity, there's a right time and a procedure. This is going back to the very beginning. For every season under heaven, there's something that needs to happen. Patience is not only a virtue, it teaches us to observe, plan, organize, and be ready. Luke 14, before you build something or go to war. That's where we left off last week when we said, one of the things that we are struggling with, one of the things that we need more than anything is to learn who we are and what we are from a larger perspective. And once we learn that, it's hard because most of us want to be experts overnight. So we have a young lady who got a music scholarship. She is brilliant at playing a particular instrument. And I mean, brilliant, so much so that a few months ago, there was a possibility that she could have jumped in with the Hawaii Symphony when her particular instrument, the person who was the first chair, left. She's at this university, and last week she posted this picture of her trying to play another instrument. And Nancy, would you say she was very, very bad at it? She was very, very bad at it. And that's because she was going from a woodwind to a stringed instrument. Now, it's interesting because one would assume that with her level of music, which is like 50 times greater than mine, that she would just be able to grab this instrument and start playing it. And we just laughed, and she was laughing at herself. And so Solomon is saying, for everything under the sun, there is a time. Sometimes we have to be patient. We must wait. Other times, we understand that we need to accelerate, and God may give us special. This is why we talked about spiritual gifts. Sometimes God actually gives us an ability. On Pentecost Sunday, suddenly these fishermen and one tax collector are able to speak in multiple languages. In other words, if God needs something done, he will give you a special ability. However, most of the time, he wants us to develop slowly and learn patience and learn from the heart. In verse 7, yet no one knows what will happen because who can tell him what will happen? There are no guarantees. Even if someone is evil, there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to conquer them in this world. Satan is the prince of this world until Jesus returns. That's when everything's going to be made right again. So when we start looking at these possibilities, we always want to wake up in the morning and assume that everything's going to go perfectly, that because we are followers of Jesus, everything's going to be made right. We're going to make all the right decisions and everything's going to go our way. And if you've ever seen the movie Bruce Almighty, when he's given this tiny fraction of power from God, the first thing he does is he moves all the cars out of the way. He uses it to make his life perfect. And then comes the struggle, the challenge but now all of a sudden, all the rest of these people have lost their life. So there's no guarantees. And so we have to understand that even if we are faithful, if we look back at the prophets, this is why the verse a few weeks ago said, when you were persecuted for my name's sake, rejoice. Because that's the way the world treated the prophets, the people that I sent into the world to tell them to repent. Verse 8, no one has authority over the wind to restrain it, and there is no authority over the day of death. There is no furlough in battle, and wickedness will not allow those who practice it to escape. Garth Brooks put a song out, and it was the first time that I'd really heard about this, But during World War I, on Christmas Eve, the Americans on this side, the Germans on that side, and everybody just kind of put down their weapons, and they were doing this, and all of a sudden somebody began to sing Silent Night, and everybody joined in. And on this particular battlefield, on this particular day, they came out of their foxholes and embraced one another because they saw something beyond what they were doing as soldiers. They saw briefly that they were humans, and they were united around something that was similar. And then the very next day, when midnight struck, they began to kill each other again. There's no such thing as us being able to say, hey, God, I'm a little out of sorts here. Can you push the pause button? Give me a chance to catch up. And I always laugh because you've heard me say this before. Isn't it amazing that 5 to 10 years ago, we kept saying, God, could you just slow the world down and give me a chance to catch up? There's so many things I want to do. And COVID came, and during those 2 years, all we could complain about was going back to being busy again, going back to the things that were tearing us apart. And most of us, me especially, there were so many things that I always said I was going to do if I was given the time, and I didn't do them. And so Solomon says, take a look at this and understand that there is no pause button on this side of heaven. Life's not perfect. Here's the big questions. Why are you a follower of Jesus? And what expectations do you have? Because when we ask those questions of ourselves, and we're willing to be honest in our answer to ourselves, even if we never tell anybody else. This is one of the things that every time we see that the church begins to lose people, and we're talking not just individual denominations, but we're actually talking about the church as a whole. And one of the things we begin to discover is that the expectations of individuals were completely different than what they found in the church. Some of it, by the way, was a particular congregation, but other people came. If you'll remember the individual that we talked about a few months ago who came into church and told us that if we wanted him as a member, we had to start feeding him after second service, and we had to create a choir. That was his expectation. If you don't have those things, I can't be part of your church. When people have those kind of expectations, they walk away. And they just say, well, the church didn't care about me. Instead of walking down the street, because, by the way, there is a church right down the road that serves lunch after church and has a choir. Oh, I don't want them. I want you to change to suit me because I like your worship time, or I like your location, or the fact that you're right off the bus or whatever. Verse 9, all this I have seen, applying my mind to all the work that is done under the sun, at a time when one man has authority over another to his harm. Now, this is the king speaking. The king is noticing that out in the world, some people are actually harmed because someone else has power over them, whether that's economically, physically, spiritually. And Solomon is hurting over this. And if the guy who, by the way, is known as the richest, wisest king is struggling to figure out how to control a nation, how to encourage a people, how to fix these things, imagine what it's like for us. I want to ask the question, what do you think Solomon did all day? This is a guy who had 300 wives, 600 concubines. He had stables full of horses. He had everything that you could imagine. What do you think he actually did all day long? Because if we were looking at the scriptures, it seemed people just showed up and said, speak to us, and he just dispensed wisdom. What were you going to say, John? I mean, I look at this, and if you think too much on any one subject, what becomes the problem? You think too much. It sounds like all he did was think and write and speak, which is more depressing, thinking about something or doing something. Because if you're actually doing something, even if you're only chipping away a tiny little bit, So when I was a kid, we went into a mine, an old gold mine in Colorado, and they take you on a tour, and they get down there, and I was in junior high school, and they handed me a hammer, and they said, "Okay, now we want you to hit this rock as hard as you can." They gave me safety goggles and a helmet, and I hit the rock. They said, "Hit it again," and I hit the rock again. And I forget how many times I hit it, but I hit the rock 2, 3, or 4 times. And then the tour guide said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Well, it wasn't all that bad." He says, "All right, now do that for 12 hours. And suddenly the realization of doing that for 12 hours over and over. And by the way, 7 days a week. Because if you took a day off, you didn't get paid. And if you didn't get paid, you weren't able to feed yourself or your family. And so this realization comes in. But at least you're doing something. Because oftentimes when you're a parent and your kids are going through something and you can't be with them, thinking about it makes it so much worse, because even if you're just there holding their hand, you've done something. Solomon is saying, look, he says the world is out of control. And every time I think about it, all I can do is bring more anxiety to my heart. See, if King Solomon, with all his wealth and power, could not prevent evil, what does that say about our world, our ability, and our focus? I mean, just think about that. Solomon, all he had to do was speak, and he had legions of people that would carry out whatever he said. And if he couldn't fix things in our world, with our political situation, our economic situation, our American dream situation, how do we think that we stand a chance? Verse 10, in such circumstances I saw the wicked buried. They came and went from the holy place, and they were praised in the city where they did so. This too is futile. Now here, by the way, he's actually pushing it, because he's saying there are individuals in the church who are there only to be noticed. He talked about them with the long flowing robes and the long prayers and the look at me syndrome. And he said these individuals who were there, he says, they died and they got buried. People still said, "Oh, do you remember so-and-so? They were so wonderful." And yet he says their hearts were such that they were doing everything for themselves and not for God. And he begins to talk about the futility of pretending to be a follower of God. Daniel, what's the name of the book that you did over the summer?
Not a fan.
Not a fan. And what was the basic summary of the book?
Pretending to be a follower, I guess.
Pretending to be a follower, because it's one thing, it's like, it's interesting, because I always chuckle when you are going around, if you were to go to Ala Moana Mall or Pearl Ridge or walk through Waikiki, the number of people that are wearing football jerseys, baseball jerseys, they wear, the t-shirts that advertise various products. And sometimes it's interesting, because you look at them and the question is, are they trying to pretend that they're actually football, baseball, sports people? Are they trying to pretend that they belong to this organization or they support this? Or are they just wearing the shirts? And when we ask that question, if you were to go up to somebody and say, are you most likely they're going to look at you and say, "No, but thank you for thinking that I was." Because it's important that people look at me, and if I wear this, I feel like people will notice me more. I feel like people will see me for something that I want to be, but I'm not. And when we look at this, he's talking about all these people that said, look, I'm a follower of Jesus. Look at the offerings I gave. I show up. I've got my reserved spot, And by the way, in Lutheranism, a reserved spot is in the back of the church, not the front of the church. In the Baptist and the Methodist church, the front of the church, everybody gets there early so they can be in the anxious seats. But I have my reserved place in the church. And when everybody walks in, they see me in my fine robes and they notice me, and I give them that little princess wave. And Solomon says it's futile, because in the end, they actually lost everything. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Verse 11, because the sentence against a criminal act is not carried out quickly, the heart of people is filled with the desire to commit crime. Now, this is interesting because this is where, if I'm really surprised that somebody didn't quote this verse during the whole political ad campaign. You don't carry out the punishment quickly, people go, hey, you can get away with it. And we do have that in our world, that some things haven't changed in literally 3,000 years. We had an individual who suffered from a crime against him, and the police officer said, I'm sorry, sir, because you do not have a video showing the crime being committed against you. There's nothing I can do. And it was interesting when the homeless guy threw the rock through our stained glass window. The first thing the police asked was, do you have a video? And I said, yes. And I showed him the surveillance video. And he says, oh, sorry, it does not show him. It shows him throwing a rock, but it doesn't show him throwing the rock through the window. So I said, allow me to show you a different angle from inside. And we lined up the times, and the time showed he threw the rock at 6 o'clock, 10 minutes, and 14 seconds. And on the other one, it showed the rock coming through at 6 o'clock, 10 minutes, and 15 seconds. It shows the rock coming through the window and landing over by the drinking fountain. And the police officer says, oh, okay, now I can actually create a report. He says, if you hadn't had that second piece of footage, I wouldn't even bother making a report because there's nothing I can do. And then we ask why things aren't getting better. It's an interesting take on judgment and punishment. And if there's a problem, shouldn't the king be able to do something about it? Or is a world beyond anyone's person's control, no matter how much power they have? And I think that's what we're looking at here. If we are honest with ourselves, there are things that we want to do that we wish someone else would do, but the truth of the matter is, it's out of everyone's control. My sister lives in a very small town in the mountains. They still have crime. They still have problems. When she was with the sheriff's department, the same people would over and over again. Nancy's dad was a judge up in a tiny town in Colorado, and he always said it was the same people that had to come before the judge. And the families would say, don't worry, Your Honor, this time we're going to fix this. Or they tell my sister, this time, we're going to fix this about my brother or my mom or whatever. And, 2 weeks later, they'd have the same problem. Families can't fix things within themselves. Communities, even no matter how small and loving they are, can't fix things. And this is why Solomon, with all of his wisdom, all of his power, all of his money, he couldn't fix what was wrong. Verse 12, although a sinner commits crime 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I also know that it will go well with God-fearing people, for they are reverent before him. Now, this seems like a strange mixture. You've got a guy who commits the same crime 100 times, and what he's saying is, and of course, the crime is committed against believers at times, and he says, and yet, the believer, because they're a believer, things will eventually work out. Now, we don't want to hear that. We don't want to hear that we're liable to suffer from multiple problems. We think, God, we understand we need a little bit in this world, but, couldn't you fix things? And he's saying, no, ultimately it will be fixed. But he says, you need to stop setting a date, a time, and restricting God and saying, okay, God, I put up with as much as I could put up with. It's time for you to fix things. He says it doesn't work that way. See, this is the difference between the law and the gospel, between judgment and mercy. The law is always the law. Now, you heard me point out a few things a few weeks ago. You are not allowed to annoy chickens at a state park. Now, why does anybody think that law may change in the very near future? Because of the cases of what? Avian flu. And all of a sudden, they're going to say, because by the way, annoying a chicken at a state park includes chasing them, bothering them, hurting them. Now, you look at this. They're going to make it illegal for the kids on e-bikes to pop wheelies while going down the street. Now, since they're actually not even enforcing a lot of traffic laws, I'm pretty sure that even if they make that illegal, it's not going to change things. We create laws to make us feel like we've done something. God's law is finite. If you violate his law, he says, no, you may not get punished, but you will, unless you know Jesus as your Savior. Then all of your sins are covered. You may or may not have to bear the punishment or the consequences of those sins, but you cannot, just because nobody noticed, just because nobody saw, doesn't mean that you're excused and it's not a problem. It is. And this is one of the problems that the Christian church is facing today, because so many people are like, yeah. No, I know you're saying that what I did or what I do is wrong, but you know what? Nobody seems to care. Therefore, it's not really a problem. And Solomon is saying, no, it is a problem. You will still have to deal with God. You either deal with him through Jesus or you deal with him through yourself. It's the difference between Peter and Judas on the last day. We also get to judgment and mercy. Judgment requires that something take place. Mercy says that the judgment can be satisfied in a different way. One of which, by the way, is for the sin to be forgiven, not by you doing something, but by someone else. We had some friends from Indiana. They were listeners to our podcast starting about 18, 19 years ago. Came to Hawaii. They wanted to take Nancy and I to lunch, and they made it very clear, we want something that's really good, place that you don't normally go. Can we take you to lunch after church? We said yes, and we went over to Uncle's Fish House right across the street. And they said, whatever you want, get it. And we got what we wanted. And when it came time for them, because they had to leave and they had to go back to their hotel and then go catch their flight. And so Brian signaled for the waiter, and the waiter came over and he says, I need the check. We got to get going. He says, your bill's been paid. And Brian says, no, I'm paying it, because he thought I did. And he looked at me and he's like, and I was innocent this time. And then he says, who paid it? And he said, another family. They were seated over there. Well, the family that was over there was a school family, and they didn't know who Brian and Denise were. They were treating me, wound up treating all of us. So now all of a sudden, Brian's like, great. I wanted to take you to lunch and somebody else paid for our bill. So now I feel like I owe them and you another lunch. This is what we're looking at. Brian realized that no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't pay the bill because it had already been paid. What? You can't outgive God. And so when we are working through this, Solomon is saying, judgment will come. But because of Jesus, we avoid the eternal consequences of that. Verse 13, however, it will not go well with the wicked, and they will not lengthen their days like a shadow, for they are not reverent before God. The question is what happens, and we're talking about in the sermon today. For so many, the end really is the end. And by that, they may have a great life, but if they don't know Jesus, the moment they die, everything changes. That's the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Now, if we look at that, Lazarus got nothing good in his life. The dogs licked his sores. He lived off crumbs, coming down from the table. The rich man lived in luxury, had everything he wanted and more. And when they die, and it's not because of the richness or the poorness. One trusted in God, the other did not. And this is what Solomon is pushing. He's saying, look, the wicked think that they can buy God off or that they can fix things because they are who they are. And he says it doesn't work that way. There is some truth, but there are plenty of wicked people, meaning not believers, who are very happy doing what they are doing. But in the end, now verse 14 says there is a futility that is done on the earth. There are righteous people who get what the actions of the wicked deserve. And there are wicked people who get what the actions of the righteous deserve. And I say that this too is futile. And none of us are going to argue. Of course it's futile. If I do the right thing and get punished, and they do the wrong thing and they get rewarded, we look at that and we say it's not fair. And God says, welcome to the world because of sin. This is why later on in the New Testament, he says, if you really want to be a follower of Jesus, do the right thing so that even when they complain about you, they're afraid to say something really bad about you. Why? Because you're doing the right thing. Because it's really hard to say, that person opened the door for me. That person paid for my lunch. That person forgave me. And people are like, when are you going to get to the bad part here? And so Solomon says, what we need to see is that who we are in the eyes of God are what really matters. This is a bold statement to make. Sometimes we don't get what we deserve, and other times we get what we don't deserve, and neither are because we believe or don't believe. Just because I'm a believer doesn't mean that everything's going to go perfect. Just because this person is not a believer doesn't mean he's not going to win the lottery, develop a patent that makes him a billionaire. It doesn't work that way, even though there's a lot of people that want it to. This is about health and wealth gospel. When you listen to some of these pastors who say, if you do all the right things and believe in Jesus, you will always be healthy, you will always be wealthy, God's going to reward you. So why do bad things happen to good people? That was Rabbi Kushner. He wrote that book 45, 50 years ago. When we ask, why do bad things happen to good people? And the answer is because we live in a world that is covered in sin, this world that's coming apart at the seams. And whenever that's happening, well, we don't have much of a choice. Because as we work through the process of goodness and evil, there comes this point where we have to ask, how would we fix it? How would we get rid of both the evil as well as the people who are committed to evil? So in the United States, we have been for years trying to figure out the difference between someone actually paying for their crime. In other words, this crime deserves this many years, and once they have served 5 years, whether they're rehabilitated or not doesn't matter. Committing this crime, 5 years in prison, you're done. And rehabilitation. It doesn't matter if they've committed this crime. We want them to become a model citizen and be rehabilitated. And so the process is not about a length of time, but it's about the person and how we can help them become a responsible citizen. And Nancy's been watching all this stuff about how she's been reading a book by, who is it, Nancy?
What are you referring to?
The book that talks about how we don't know who should go to jail and who shouldn't. Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. And it's in this process that we actually want to believe that if I take this person and I put them through this cycle, they're going to be fine. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we say, well, if so-and-so committed this crime, in 5 years, they will have learned their lesson. We can release them. They're going to be fine. There's a brand new thing coming out about Charles Manson. There's all these things where these individuals, there are just some people in the world that they will never be rehabilitated. And that bothers us as a nation and often as a people. We want them to be able to say, I committed this crime, I served 1 year, now I'm free and I'm a better person. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes bad things happen to good people because they are surrounded by bad people. It's just the way it is. Every time that I read an article and it says, this happened at 3 a.m., and then they name a particular neighborhood that I know is not a great neighborhood to be in, let alone at 3 a.m., it doesn't take a genius to say, wow. We have to ask the question, because if you go into a neighborhood that is not good at noon, you really probably shouldn't be there at 3 a.m. And this is what Solomon is saying. Sometimes bad things happen to good people because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Other times they happen just because of happenstance. They're driving down the road, they're doing everything right, and yet in the blink of an eye, everything changes for them. Verse 15, so I commended enjoyment because there is nothing better for man under the sun than to eat, drink, and enjoy himself. for this will accompany him in his labor during the days of his life that God gives him under the sun. This is one verse that a lot of people know besides the birds turn, turn, turn. Is Solomon really telling us to eat, drink, and be merry, or is this a trick statement? And to be honest, it could go either way, depending on how we want to read what Solomon has been telling us in all these verses. You see, one of the things I always ask is, when somebody walks up to me and says, would you like a free, and then they fill in the blank. And the answer is always yes. But is it really free? How much is it going to cost me? What do I have to do to get it? And so once in a while, when somebody walks up and they're actually truly giving you something that's free and there's no strings attached, we attach so many things to it that we just back away and we say, I'm afraid. To eat, drink, and be merry. Enjoy your life. Go to a concert. Take a walk on the beach. Leave work 15 minutes early to go do something that is going to recreate us. To do these things. And that this is the question of, how does that work? Solomon is encouraging us to make fun of the world. But instead of living as though life has no meaning, thus the need for distractions, live a life that allows you to eat, drink, and be merry because you know God is taking care of you. See, oftentimes we do the things we do not because we're okay with it, but because we need a distraction. I doubt that any of you do this, but I am absolutely amazed at the number of times when I have a deadline looming and suddenly I'm calling friends, I'm playing games, I'm organizing my closet because I'm trying to avoid doing what I know I need to do. Wrong reason to do those things. But there are other times. So 25 years ago, one of our members worked at the theater in Waikiki that showed the IMAX films, and they had just re-released Star Wars in IMAX. And he calls me up and he says, Mitch, bring the kids and come down. And Katie was too young, so I took Molly and Micah. The problem was, this was on December 22nd. Anybody know why that raised my anxiety state? Because in 2 days we were going to have Christmas Eve. I had a million things to do, but I knew that we were never going to get this chance again. Kids really wanted to go. So I said, yep, I'll take them. What I didn't realize was going all the way down there, parking, walking the kids to the theater, watching Star Wars on this huge screen where you can actually see the wires moving and Mark Hamill's face, and he's got a little blemish, and you're watching all this. And when I got home that night, I took the kids and we went to bed, and I woke up the next morning, I was refreshed and was able to get everything done in a less amount of time because I had unwired my brain to the point where it was able to think freely again. So there's a difference between celebrating God's love and celebrating the goodness of the world and doing things because we need distractions and we're running away. Solomon says, if you know that God loves you, if you know that God's taking care of you, if you know that when you step out of this world, you're going to step into the arms of God forever, it changes your thought process of life. Verse 16, when I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the activity that is done on the earth, even though one's eyes do not close in sleep day or night. Now, this is strange. I mean, just think about that. I applied my mind to know wisdom. The guy who, by the way, asked God for wisdom, and God said, you're going to be the wisest person ever lived. If all you want to do is worry, then you will ruin your health, your family, and your world. To worry over things that are out of your control is a waste of everything that you are. We're going to do it anyway. But sometimes we need to walk into somebody's life and say, there is nothing you can do about it. Take a deep breath and let's see if we can't apply ourselves to something else that will make a difference. There are times in our life when no matter how hard we try, no matter how much money we have, no matter how powerful we are, there are things that are out of our control. And if we're just going to drill down and focus on those things, it's just going to ruin us. This is, by the way, if you remember this story, David and Bathsheba, they conceive a child. God says the child is going to die. And so David immediately covers himself in sackcloth and ashes, ignores his duties as king, spends all the time in a room. And then the word comes that the child has died. And they're afraid to tell David. And finally, one of them says, they draw straws, and the one goes, I don't want to do this. He's probably going to have me killed. And he goes in and he says, David, the child has died. And David gets up, takes a shower, puts on a fresh robe, and go back to work. And they go, David, your child just died. Why are you doing this? And David goes, while the child was alive, I begged and pleaded with God to save him. Now that the child is gone, there's nothing more that I can do, and I need to get back to work. I'm grieving, but I have work that needs to be done. And we look at that story, and we can go 100 different ways with it. But what David was saying was, while the child was alive, I had a chance, and I pleaded and begged God. But the moment the child died, it was beyond even my ability, and so I simply went back to work. And this will be how I deal with my grief and my mourning. So back to spiritual gifts. If you live the life that God gave you, using the gifts he gave you, and you get done what you can get done, then you have no reason to worry or feel like your life was wasted. And by the way, even if you didn't get done everything that you could have gotten done, you are forgiven in the name of Jesus. This is one of those things when we want to know who we are and what our purpose is in life. I have no doubt that in the grand scheme of things, there was the greatest amount that we could do, and there's the least amount that we could do. And we're not going to go to either of those extremes. We're going to be somewhere in the middle. And people go, yes, but I could have done so much more. And God says, yeah, you could have. But because God has eternal foreknowledge and already knows what we are going to accomplish, God set the bar at what he knows we're going to do. So we're not failing God. And if God knew that we were going to get this far when we could have gotten this far, he's going to cover the rest of this. He's not going to say, well, it's too bad this entire country got lost because you didn't do your thing. That's not the way God works. That's what we learn from the book of Jonah. And so we have to understand that God has given you your time, your talent, your passions, and he knows everything that's going to happen. And you are the best you, and you're going to get done what you are supposed to get done. Verse 17, I observed all the work of God and concluded that man is unable to discover the work that is done under the sun. Even though a man labors hard to explore it, he cannot find it. Even if the wise man claims to know it, he's unable to discover it. We can't fix the world. That's the work of God alone. It's foolish for people to try to do what only God can do. Only God has given us our commission, and that's all that we are required to do. We step forward saying, okay, God, I trust that if you have called me to do this, you've given me everything I need. You will work with and through me to accomplish all that needs to be done. And if I fail, you will send somebody else in my place, because you are a loving God and you're not going to allow someone to be lost for eternity because I couldn't get my act together. That person will have the opportunity that they needed. Whether they choose to embrace it or not, it's a whole different matter. Now we're going to move into chapter 9. I just want to go a couple verses. So verse 1, indeed, I took all this to heart and explained it all. The righteous, the wise, and their works are in God's hands. People don't know whether to expect love or hate. Everything lies ahead of them. So, what promises were you given at your birth by your parents? Do you remember? What did they say to you? Because I guarantee they said something to you, but because you were a baby, you didn't understand them and you may or may not have heard them. But what promises do parents make to their children when they're born? Then, later when they grow up, what promises does the family make to them? What promises does the world make to them? The school system, the government. When we think about this, what are all the promises that get made to people for the sake of someone who is born and is living? If you listen to the politicians, I guarantee if we took every political speech that was made, we are promised everything by the government. So we had a guy in church, first service. He and his wife were here during COVID. And then they had to move to Japan as soon as they allowed a little bit of international travel. And it was funny because during our online services, I noticed, and this was just me being sarcastic, But we went to the store and there were no cherry Pop-Tarts. And I only eat one flavor of Pop-Tart, and that's cherry. And so here I was bemoaning the fact that COVID had taken from me my beloved cherry Pop-Tarts. And by the way, I only eat them once in a while. So anyway, next thing you know, I show up at church one day. Hanging on the door is a Navy commissary bag with a box of cherry Pop-Tarts in it. No notes, no nothing. Anyway, later on, Chris told me that he and his wife got me the cherry Pop-Tarts because they had them at the commissary. So today he's on his way from Japan to DC, stopped in Honolulu for a couple of days. Guess what he brought me? Cherry Pop-Tarts. Now, the interesting thing about that is, I would never ask anyone to promise me cherry Pop-Tarts. Because once upon a time, I used to think that I could go to the store, that it always had an item, and that they always would have the item. And so when my children or somebody from the mainland or the office or the district calls and says, hey, Mitch, since you're coming to the meeting, can you bring blah, 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 blah? And I, without a hesitation, would say yes. More and more now, I go to various stores and they no longer carry certain things, or they're out of certain things because COVID changed the way that the world operates. I go to restaurants that I had an absolute favorite dish and they go, sorry. We went to Bravo the other day. The pastor at Our Redeemer, by the way, has accepted a call to New Orleans. And so Christian and Kayla and I went to lunch to talk about his new church and stuff. And we went to Bravo because he'd never been there. And I said, I'll have the Bravo melt. And the waitress said, we no longer have that anymore, sir, and we're never going to get it back. Choose something else. Well, that took away everything I was looking forward to for lunch. But there's moments like that that are taking place. What promises were you made? How serious do you take those promises? How do you think they're going to come about? What expectations did you have at your birth? And the answer is you were going to be fed and you were going to be kept warm and cuddled because otherwise you cried. That was the only thing that you could communicate. But then you turned 16, 18, 21, 35. You were 6, you were 5, you were all those ages. What were your expectations? Because when we ask ourselves, and if we were to keep a diary and we're totally honest about all of our expectations, and we asked, why are they our expectations? Who do we expect to fulfill our expectations at those various ages? And when we start asking that question, we're going to be surprised because the older we get, sometimes our expectations change, sometimes they don't. But often the answer to how those expectations are going to be fulfilled change. Verse 2, everything is the same for everyone. There's one fate for the righteous and the wicked, for the good and the bad, for the clean and the unclean, for the one who sacrifices and the one who does not sacrifice. As it is for the good, so it is for the sinner. As for the one who takes an oath, so for the one who fears an oath. Are we talking earthly or heavenly? Because that goes against everything that the Bible teaches if we're saying that everybody who dies goes to the same place, whether it's heaven or hell. So when he says, everybody suffers the same fate, we have to ask, what could this possibly mean? And Solomon assumes, by the way, that we know our Hebrew literature, we know the Old Testament scriptures, we know our theology. And so when he says, everybody, whether they are a believer or not believer, no matter who they are, they all suffer the same fate. And he's waiting for us to fill in the blank of death. Because no matter who we are, no matter what we are going to die. This now adds these questions that'll end this week. What's the purpose of the church? What end result is the church working toward or for? Because this is important. What promises does the church make about you? What does the church promise you? When you come to church, what promises do you expect that there is only one place that you can get these expectations fulfilled, and it's the church? Reconciliation, forgiveness, Jesus. Because as I remind us over and over again, the only thing this church can share with you is Jesus. Everything else is a bonus. I can't guarantee coffee. I can't guarantee electricity. I can't guarantee a facility. I can promise you, no matter where we are, no matter what's going on in the world, I can share Jesus with you. Everything else may or may not be real. And so when Solomon begins pushing this and he begins to say, we all share the same faith, this is meant for us to look back and say, I may not have a red Ferrari, but I have Jesus. I may not have the expensive house that my neighbor does, but I have Jesus. This is not meant to be a consolation prize. This is meant to say that when it's all said and done, and my neighbor and I both die, if we die on the same day at the same time, I'm stepping into heaven, where suddenly I have no longer any needs because everything's taken care of. And what I want is for my neighbor, whether he is rich, whether he has all the toys, I want him to experience it as well. I don't want to punish him because he got everything on the earth, the rich man and Lazarus. I want him to understand and see what I see. Not as an escape, not as pie in the sky theology, but as an understanding that I do everything I can in this world with everything that I have to make a difference. And if I have a house and a car and a decent life, great. But if I don't, I know that God will take care of me. I'm not going to use the word reward. That's a bad word theologically. But that God will take care of me, both on this earth and in heaven. And this is where, by the way, we have major struggles because we look at people in third world countries. We look at people within our own country, and we have to ask, okay, God, when you say you're going to take care of everybody, what does that mean? We'll spend a little time talking about that next week. Go in peace, serve the Lord in gladness, and probably about another 3, maybe 4 weeks with Ecclesiastes, then we'll be finished and we'll start something a little less heavy.